I had a choice. I could go let go of some employees, or what I ended up doing was cutting the payroll across the board. I remember walking to Starbucks with an employee. He's giving me this whole pitch about what an amazing job he's doing, and he's asking me for a raise. I had to share the news that not only was he not getting a raise, but he was actually getting a 10% haircut in his pay. I ended up losing that employee.
What if you lost your largest client, representing 40% of your entire revenue almost overnight? Most founders would panic and start mass layoffs, but our guest today chose a different path. He asked his entire team to take a pay cut so he could keep the talent together, and then made a pretty high stakes gamble. He hired a salesperson and paid them more than he was paying himself. That move didn't just save the company, it fueled a decade of growth that transformed a one-man shop into one of the largest independent agencies in the world. Welcome to today's episode of Your Business Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Shapiro, author of Your Business Growth Playbook, and my guest today is Jon Morris. Jon, welcome to the show.
Jeremy, thanks so much for having me here. Really excited to be here.
So rewinding in time, Jon, you had this really cool start that all began with some prize money while you were at university. Talk to us about what that was, where that money came from, and what you did with that.
Yeah, so I went to University of Chicago for business school, and they have an annual business plan competition called the New Venture Challenge. And a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to join. It's basically a class and a competition. And so I just thought it would be fun to enter the class or the competition. And honestly, all I wanted to do was win the competition. Like, I wasn't looking to start a new business. I really thought of this as a class. I get credit for the class. But then we ended up doing really well. We took second place in the competition. We won $10,000, which was our prize money and was the seed money to start Rise Interactive. And I decided, well, if all these entrepreneurs and venture capitalists believe in us, why don't we give this a try? And so Rise Interactive was born.
Now, was Rise the business that you guys submitted into that business competition?
So yes and no. It was the same entity, but the business model morphed probably 5 times over 16 years. So the original company name was Internet Marketing Institute. And the original idea was to provide seminars or training on how to do digital marketing yourself. And as I was putting these 2-day seminars on, I found 2 things. The first thing is I found it very difficult to get new customers to go to these classes repeatedly. And the second thing is everyone who was in the class just kept on asking, couldn't you just do this for me? And I decided that was a better business model. And so we switched from teaching digital marketing to doing digital marketing.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about in the book, and I work with clients on all the time, is this idea that you can teach people how to do it on their own, the DIY. You can do stuff with them, like coaching, mentoring, and all that. And then there's the done for you, where they just get a result and they pay you for that. And as you work through those are worth far more to the customer or the client, and you can charge accordingly. But the value also goes up dramatically as well. And that's cool that you played in all those spaces to find your way with Rise. Now, digital marketing is a pretty competitive space to be in from a teaching education standpoint and all. This is back in like 2004. What was the landscape like then? Why did you choose digital marketing, and how did that space evolve over time?
So I chose digital marketing because that actually was my background. So I graduated college in 1996. It's when I started my first digital marketing agency. And I didn't know about the internet until January of 1996. And so I started my business in May or June of 1996. And it only happened because I couldn't get a job. And so by not being able to get a job, I ended up creating what I'll call as a computer company, or a company that helped really with anything related to computers. And I started building the ugliest website you ever seen. And then people started asking me, well, can't you just build this for me? Or sorry, people started asking me, well, how are you going to market my website? And it was 1996. I had no idea. No one had any idea. So I started researching all the best practices of digital marketing and truly became one of the pioneers and leading experts in search engine optimization. And so that's really how I got started. And that's how I came up with the idea. Now, the reason why 2004 was much more special than 1996 was there just wasn't that many good places to advertise in 1996. In 2004, massive amounts of money was leaving traditional advertising and moving over to digital marketing. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, that's incredible that you were in that space so early. I mean, I remember the websites I was building in 1996 and what was involved then. And the whole idea of digital marketing or even SEO, like these weren't even terms people were talking about, outside of very, very small circles at that time. And you got in there nice and early. What did that early momentum feel like as you are now growing this newly minted name of digital marketing agency and like doubling the business every year?
It was a lot of fun. It's funny, by the way. Yes, I was doubling it in my very early stages, but, I did 12,000 in sales my first year. I did 80,000 in sales my second year. I did 350,000 in sales my third year. It wasn't until like year 5 or year 6 till people actually started even believing in me, where, growing from 12,000 to 80,000 isn't like a major success story. But from my standpoint, I was proud. Like I worked hard and I'm an incrementalist and I wanted to make investments that every year I kept on growing. And I felt like I did that. But I remember a friend of my aunt's where it was probably when I got to the $2 million marker. And he was like, John, I used to see you at holiday parties and we were talking like, what is this guy doing? And I was like, well, clearly you knew more about what you were doing than I did, so it was interesting to see, people's belief in me and in the business change as we started to scale.
It's funny. I think back to when my wife and I were dating in our earlier years, her parents and family had no idea what I did or how my business worked. And just as they would start to figure out what it was that I did, I had some new company or something else launching. And that totally just, changed things. And they're like, we just figured this out. What do you mean you have a new business? And it's funny how folks with 9-to-5s, your friends and so forth, don't always get it, but your fellow entrepreneurs and founders do. So John, you used a word that I really like, incrementalist. Say more about that. That is such a cool word and identity.
When I first started Rise, I used to do marathons every year. And if you ever do marathon training, it takes 18 weeks. And every week you go on a long run. And, your first long run is 6 miles. And then the next week it's 7 miles. And then it goes down to 5, and then up to 9, then up to 10, then down to 7. And that was the model I took. I had a 20-year time view, except rather than miles, I looked at it as dollars, and then rather than weeks, I looked at it as years. And so the idea is I wanted to build a great business. I'm not focused on the exit or, any of the flashy kind of things you learn in business school. Every year I wanted to make investments to make it so that my business next year was better than it was this year. And those things compound. If you make small incremental investments and your competitors aren't making those investments, you're building something that is better and unique every single time.
I really like that comparison with marathon training and business. I'm an endurance athlete myself, and the overlaps and parallels between business and athletics are endless, right? And what you're talking about there is, we would say in training blocks, right? And you're looking at training blocks for your business. And that is so cool, John. So when we have businesses, right, you can have one end of the spectrum where you work with 3 high-end clients that pay you a lot of money, but it's really your revenue is pretty compartmentalized in only a small number of large compartments. Or you go the other way where you have millions of customers and lower dollar amount. And if you lose 1 or 2, it doesn't make a difference, right? And you sort of had this hybrid middle space where there were customers across all revenue levels, but one particular stood out that was taking up 40% of that top line revenue. Walk us through how you got to that point and what happened with that client.
Sure. So this is 2008 is when I got the news that I lost this client. It was 40% of my revenue. They were one of the major players in the financial institutions. They became a victim of, the financial crisis and went bankrupt. So overnight, my largest customer no longer existed. And this was December of 2008. I got the news. My goal was to double in 2009 before I had that news. And I was talking to one of my employees, and I talked about how I wanted to double. And he's like, John, it's just not going to happen. He's like, but we can make the investments necessary to double, which is what we did. And so I started the year off 40% down, but my cost was still, where it was when I had that client. So I had to make adjustments very quickly to manage cash flow, to make sure that everything was going smoothly.
So tell us about some of those decisions. When we talk about leadership, that often comes down to making decisions, and they're not always the most popular decisions. What did you guys do to get out of that hole of starting the year 40% down?
We had to cut costs. Like, there was no rhyme or reason, or there was no two ways about it. Like, we had to bring down costs. So I had a choice. I could go let go of some employees and have a smaller team. Or what I ended up doing was cutting the payroll or across the board. So I cut everybody's pay, including my own, including my second in command. Like, we all took a haircut in salary. And the idea behind it was that, we would bring people back up when we got a chance. But that was the strategy I chose. Is I wanted to keep the team together. I loved the team. I thought culturally it was the right thing to do. And there's some challenges with that. But, I remember walking to Starbucks with an employee. And right as we get to the door, he's giving me this whole pitch about what an amazing job he's doing, all the great work, and he's asking me for a raise. And I had to share the news that not only was he not getting a raise, but he was actually getting a 10% haircut in his pay. And I ended up losing that employee, which that's the one kind of key learning is when you reduce cost across the entire company, some people will choose to leave, and they might not be the people you want to leave. So it's like you end up getting the turnover that you are going to get anyway, but it's less you choosing it and other people choosing it.
It's interesting when you share that. Like, it's one thing to look at a spreadsheet or look at your financials, see the numbers, take out your pencil and redline some things or adjust and say, we're going to cut this and change that. But then when you get to the front line, like you're talking about, having the conversations one-on-one with people or the company, wide, like an all hands, for example, and sharing this kind of news, those are very, very different things. And the realities of that are challenging. Like, what was that like breaking the news? You shared that one story with the employee on your walk, but what was it like sharing the news with the rest of the team? And how did you in leadership get around this idea of salary cuts and doing all these things to avoid layoffs?
There were a couple of things. The first thing is I made it very clear that we weren't going to fire anybody. I made it very clear that this will be short-lived and that we're going to grow our revenue back and that I will adjust salaries back after we do so. I ended up creating competitions. So, for example, we had prize money for people who wrote the best blog post, and we would measure it based on how much traffic each one of those posts got. And we started all going to networking events together. So, there was probably 9 of us at the time. And when you go to a networking event and 9 people are there from the same company, no one thinks that that's the entire company. So it looked bigger than we were. We ended up doing really well in Q1 of 2009 from a new business perspective. So by April, I actually was able to not only reinstate people's salaries, but I was able to pay them back for the money that they lost by taking the pay cut in that first quarter.
That's amazing. That is such an incredible and short turnaround time comeback story. We talk about this idea of failure is inevitable in various ways. So it's not about avoiding it. Like, look, we de-risk things, but when it happens, like, what matters is how quickly we get back up and what we do in that window. And like, Jon, you really turned that around so quick, and that's incredible. On the content side, I was in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago, and one of the cool things we did is we toured the Motley Fool. We got like this really neat tour of their offices and meeting with their staff and all. And they did something really similar to what you're talking about, is that their whole business model at the time was they get traffic from articles and content, and they would look at first cookie. So like, what was the article that got someone in to convert them into a paying customer? And so they had literally screens on the wall dashboard of content articles and the author, and they would bonus the content writers based on the content that brought in new customers. So it wasn't like just crank out content. It was like, no, get us content that actually gets us new customers and grows the business. And so you use this really cool contest model with your team as well.
Not only that, but I did this several times throughout the company. And we actually launched our entire creative department based on that competition. So one woman on our team was on the SEO team, and she created this incredible infographic that was like gorgeously designed on like how SEO works. I was just expecting like a regular blog. I wasn't expecting like this masterpiece of artwork. And then we started selling infographics, and then we started developing websites. And then and she ended up becoming the chief creative officer of the company, over time. And it turns out she had she went to design school and she had this amazing talent. I never would have known about it if it wasn't for that competition.
Had you not given your team a chance to rise to the occasion, you never would have known. Now, I want to just dig into the all hands on deck approach to getting the business back on track. It's interesting because you have team members doing all kinds of things that are not sales related or growing the business. And suddenly you're telling them, guess what? You're going to a networking event. What was the playbook you gave them, telling folks like you're going to go out to an event? Like, what was the expectation? What did you want them to do?
Look, we were in startup stage. We were all very young. We were all, I would say, fairly early, like mostly in our 20s, maybe some in their 30s in our career. And so there was already an all hands feeling. If I compare that to when we had hundreds of employees, that would never have worked, at that stage. And so it worked for the dynamic that we were in. But also, when I interviewed people, I was very clear. Like my very first hire, we're in my 1,300 square foot condo. I'm having a one-on-one conversation with the person. That condo, by the way, was my office for our first 7 employees. And I said to them, I was like, my goal is to be the largest independent digital agency in the world. And I told them about the whole marathon thing. I said, I have a 20-year time horizon. We're going to make incremental investments. But I'm looking for people where they understand this is going to be the hardest job they have ever had. I'm not looking for someone to work 9 to 5. And so I set the stage very early on of what I was expecting this company to be. And that this wasn't a lifestyle business, that this is going to be hard. And so anyone who took that job, that expectation was set from the beginning. So they were all in, they were open to doing blog posts, they were open to doing networking. There was no complaining about, long hours at that moment in time. Later on, there became, as you became bigger, that philosophy fell apart.
Got it. Are you enjoying this episode? Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. That'll help you get more episodes automatically as soon as they come out. So hit that subscribe button right now. And if you have a minute, leave a quick rating and review. That helps support the show. So what I'm hearing there is you made it clear from your team at the point of even interviewing and hiring that we are a scrappy startup. We do whatever it takes to grow from sales, content, all of it.
Not just a scrappy startup with high ambition. If I take my current company, I'm not looking to build a rocket ship. I want slow, sustainable, repeatable growth is the approach for this business. I'm not looking for people to work 80 hours a week. I am looking for them to work really intense hours for the hours they work, but I'm okay. It's just a different strategy for this business.
One last question I have for you on sort of the team and layoffs and all that before we move on. You had a lot of different ways you could have approached this. You guys got back to growth pretty quickly. You could have taken on some debt to get there. You could have laid off team members. You chose the reducing payroll direction. Like, given all the options and ways you could have approached this, why did you choose the haircut and salaries versus other approaches to get back to growth?
A couple things. If I was to go back in time, I probably would have done it a little bit differently. Like I mentioned, that one person who left, that person was a superstar that we lost. I would have absolutely reduced costs, but I probably would have not done cuts across the board. And I probably would have preserved like the core team I wanted to build upon. That being said, I really like debt when it's for cash flow management, meaning like you win a huge client and they pay their bills slowly. I don't like debt for building growth unless you have a really proven playbook. Debt's not patient, meaning it charges interest. You have to make payments every month. There's no guarantee that I'm going to grow that business back. So that's one way. I owned 100% of the company. I wasn't looking for outside investors. That's the second thing. And then the third one is, the hardest part of running any professional service company. So a marketing agency, a law firm, an accounting firm, is 80% of your cost are people. And, like when I look at my first agency, which failed, the one I started right out of college, I was petrified to fire people. And when I started Rise, I really looked myself in the mirror to say that I'm going to make decisions with my brain, but operate with my heart. And I'm going to make the tough decisions. And, I used to tell people all the time that no one is safe within the company, including me, that I would fire myself at a heartbeat. And I remember one employee said, Jon, I know you say that, but it rings a little hollow. Like, would you really fire yourself? And my answer was absolutely. Like, there's two versions of me. There is me, the owner of the company that owns 100% of the shares. And I've hired me as the CEO. And founders fire themselves all the time. Like if your income statement's not looking good, like if I had 2009 was my asterisk year, we were flat that year, which basically we started down 40%. And, if 2010, 2011, 2012, I was flat every single year, I would either be evaluating, is this the right business or am I the right person to be running this business?
What I'm hearing there, Jon, is like really smart cash flow management is what that comes down to. So bravo. All right. So speaking of cash flow management, you're in the middle of the financial crisis. You're not laying off, but you're reducing salaries. And at the same time, you're also making one really big key hire. Tell me about that hire, what led you to that decision, how you justified that, and what all went into that.
If you remember, I have this high ambitious goal, right? I want to grow from nothing to this really large business. Well, the only way you're going to do that is if you invest in sales and marketing. I had a client of mine that was flat out phenomenal. And he was running the sales and marketing for one of my clients. And everybody I met, I compared to him. I was like, I want to find a Howard. And eventually, Howard wanted to leave. And I didn't have to find a Howard. I could just hire a Howard. The other part was I wasn't able to afford him for 3 years. And because we did so well in that first quarter and we were able to stabilize the business, it was a big gamble. And the gamble was we were going to pay this person more than everybody, including myself in the company. We ended up hiring him and he was a massive home run. It worked incredibly well.
What was the definition of success at the point you were hiring? Like how were you going to determine if he was earning his keep and doing a good job or not?
So a couple of things. I tried multiple, commission-only salespeople. I tried hiring a couple other salespeople. I happen to be fairly good at sales. I have good sales infrastructure. Phase one was just, is he following up on leads? So I would have something in the CRM, and even though it was assigned to him, I kept track of like when we're supposed to get back to people. And I'd be like, so Howard, did you follow up on so-and-so? I was like, yep, already updated, already in Salesforce. I was like, what about so-and-so? Yep, already sent an email, updated in Salesforce. Like he was just on top of everything. Then it really came down to closing. Like, could he close deals? And it got to the point where he was a better closer than myself. So when you think about the success of a salesperson, ultimately, are sales growing? Like that's the most important thing. But when you are in the early stages of a salesperson, you got to judge them based on their activity and their intensity. So the first thing that I care about is just speed and follow-up. How quickly, if someone raises their hand, do you get back to them? If you say that you're going to call them in 3 weeks, do you call them? And so when Howard started, although I signed leads to him, I really was keeping track of all the leads myself. And I'd be like, hey, did you follow up on so-and-so? It's like, yep, followed up with them already in Salesforce. Yep, followed up with them already in Salesforce. And so once I felt comfortable that I didn't have to worry about something slipping through the cracks, the next thing then was, could he close? How well did he understand our business? He was on the client side, so he understood digital marketing, but he had to understand why we were great, what made us unique. Ultimately, I consider myself a really good salesperson. he was a better closer than me. Like he just, and he studied sales. He really focused on like it as a craft and read books and went to seminars and got certified in Sandler. So you had someone who understood digital marketing, who had the intensity, who had the, the desire to learn and grow. And ultimately, I used to, like, when I would show a presentation, I had all these little stars of like milestones. And I had, my first star was when I hired him, and our sales was like a hockey stick right after that. So getting the right salesperson is a massive thing for the success of your organization.
That's fantastic. And I want to point out for listeners a few key things you touched on there. One is this concept we talk about of leading indicators versus trailing, right? Trailing is like, oh, look, there's money in the bank. Leading is those checkpoints along the way, like you're talking about. Is he getting the leads in the system? Is he following up? Is he having the calls? Is he closing? Like all those numbers. And that really falls into knowing your numbers and having each of those funnel steps mapped out like you so well did. And now you're able to manage by that and improve by that and compare by that. So huge kudos on that. Something else you did there, Jon, too, is you guys started to diversify up the revenue in terms of what it was you were selling and how you guys made money. How did you look at customer quantity and customer pricing and that kind of stuff?
So a couple things. I lost my largest client. It was 40% of my revenue. My first business went bankrupt because of customer concentration. I lost 3 clients that represented 80% of my revenue in 1 month and was not able to recover from that. I never wanted that to be my problem again. And so, Rise's goal was to have 50 great customers. And every year those customers would get bigger and bigger. But I was always very worried about customer concentration. So I invested very heavily in sales and marketing to grow and win my next big customer. But I also looked at how do you expand your revenue stream so that you have more services so you don't become too dependent on one service line as well. My original model, so, I started teaching digital marketing. I then decided to start doing it ourselves, and we really focused on search marketing. And our tagline was the agency's search agency. And what we would do is we would basically white label our services to larger digital marketing agencies, web development companies, and be their search partner behind the scenes. And that's how we grew. But then people wanted more services. We started to go direct to customer. They wanted programmatic, actually before even programmatic media buying, they wanted display advertising. Programmatic didn't exist when I first started Rise. Then they wanted affiliate marketing. And so we eventually built a full, what I'll say, digital media offering. So if you wanted to advertise on the web and there was a method to do so, we wanted to be able to deliver the whole holistic strategy. That actually became a big part of our differentiator. We created something called interactive investment management. And the idea is just like you manage a stock portfolio, we would manage your digital media portfolio. And we would really understand the ROI to all the different places you advertise and make adjustments accordingly. And so that won us a lot of business because it allowed us to shift if something wasn't working well. And it also was a unique perspective as opposed to being like, I'm just great at one thing.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing there for our listeners is instead of being too concentrated on high-end services for a few clients, you had additional service tiers as well as product line to service a wider ideal customer profile, as well as offer more to the existing customer base you had, ultimately delivering the results they're looking for, not just education, information, or, one narrow niche service.
It's a good summary.
Cool. So on the sales side of things, you started out like many companies do with founder-led sales. You've dialed in your sales playbook. You did a good job. And then you brought on Howard, and he was doing a great job in terms of closing even better than you were. But tell us a little bit more about how you stepped out of that role in sales and started to now grow not just another you, but a sales team.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, I do have an ego and I do think I'm really good at sales. So it took a while to accept that someone might be better than me at sales. But the other part is, and this is something every founder should understand, you will never be a full-time salesperson. You have to meet with employees. You have to meet with clients. You have to, do your taxes. There's just stuff that eats up time away. So, there's a few things that philosophically. So the first one is, if you want to scale and grow, it's not going to happen by accident. There's one key number, there's many key numbers, but one of the key numbers that I really look at is, what percent of your revenue do you spend on sales and marketing? And if you're listening to this, no matter what industry you're in, there is a benchmark. And I want you on the higher end of that benchmark, not the lower end. Meaning, I'll use marketing agencies. The average marketing agency spends 8% of their revenue on sales and marketing. Well, if you know this and you want to grow faster than the competition, you can try to spend more as a percent of your revenue. So that was one of the things that philosophically we try to do. We spent between 15 to 20% of our revenue on sales and marketing. And so as we scale, we have more money to invest. So we went beyond Howard and we hired multiple salespeople. We hired a marketing team. We started sponsoring events. We did paid media. We did all sorts of things that do to help fuel growth.
When we look at things like investing in sales teams, each sales rep usually has like this bathtub curve for their ROI. Like initially day one, they're not making money, but at a certain period, for a rep for your company, when it is they start to break even and start to make money. And so you can go sequentially, bring on one rep, get them profitable, bring on a second. Or like you said, if you know your numbers, you can stack it, go deep, and know you're going to go deep, deep down a very deep bathtub curve, but rocket out the other side of that. And I want to highlight for our listeners something really valuable you shared there, which is that sales and marketing isn't a nice to have. It is a must have, and that there are benchmarks for your companies, for your industry. And I love, Jon, that you highlighted you want to be on the upper end of that spend if your goal is growth, because it gets you there faster.
A lot of my competitors that were smaller than Rise, like over time, kept on asking me like, well, how'd you do it? And I always follow up with a question. I was like, well, what percent of your revenue do you spend on sales and marketing? And they're like, oh, we don't spend anything. It's all word of mouth. And I was like, well, then you shouldn't be surprised that you're not growing. And the worst part about it is they're marketing agencies. Like, how come they don't believe in marketing if that's what they do for a living?
It's the cobbler's kids, right? It's the marketing agency's marketing. So now let's go towards sort of the other end of the spectrum on Rise's story here. You were at the point where you guys are at $12 million in revenue, and in that final stretch, you scaled up to 40 million. What got you from that 12 to 40? And what's sort of the end of the rainbow on that journey?
So a few things. One, when you think about growing, there are only three numbers that matter. It's how well do you hold on to your customers? How well do you upsell your customers? And how well are you at winning new business? I always tell people your number one sales goal is never lose a customer due to performance. So if you lose a customer, I want it to be for, I did not cause the financial crisis. I had nothing to do with my client and some of the risky bets they made and they went bankrupt. So, although I lost them as a customer, I didn't lose them due to performance. And so if you can hold on to your customers, that's the number one thing you want to do. We were really good at that. And we constantly invested in making our services better. So the idea is that every year your services are better than the year before. And so, you grow and you hold on to your customers. Second one is, I'm going to say just a little bit of luck. One of our clients went on a massive growth spree. And so we did two things really well. The first thing we did is we held on to them. To give you an idea, they were about $60,000 a year in fees in year one, and they were mid seven figures by the time we ended up parting ways. So that is one thing, that picking the right customers and growing with them. I would say we were decent upselling, and I'm going to give you two different ways that you can upsell. The first one is we had a day-to-day contact at all of our clients, and oftentimes they managed more things than we offered to them. We were really good at upselling that customer. Where we, in my opinion, were not good is when other people in the company, our clients, were responsible for, a different service. Give you an example. One of our clients had 6 business units, and we worked with one business unit, I don't think we ever got into the other 5 business units. And then the third one was we were really good at winning new business. We were really good at responding to RFPs. We were really good at top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of funnel. We invested really heavily in sales and marketing. And so the combination of doing a great job of keeping our customers and doing a great job of winning new business, I think is really what fueled our growth.
Nice. So to recap for listeners, what I'm hearing there, Jon, is those 3 numbers are your retention, your account growth, expand, and new business, land. So if you're landing new business, expanding existing business, and keeping your customers, those are 3 great high-level KPIs in your mind.
Yes, those are the only KPIs that fuel growth. But what I would say is of those 3, your most important one is what your existing customers and getting them to renew and holding on to them.
How did this insights-driven, like financial approach and the strong look at cash flow and performance and all lead to the successful exit of Rise?
I think there are 2 critical things. The first one is, do you have a decision-making framework? I believe there are only 3 KPIs that matter. And those KPIs are year-over-year revenue growth, profit margin, and cash relative to monthly overhead. If you grow your cash, you create optionality. You get to go buy businesses. You have a rainy day fund. So when you lose your largest client, you have a time period to weather the storm. As you mentioned earlier, really good cash flow management is really important. Yeah, the second one is profit margin. And there's industry benchmarks, and you can use that as performance. In the professional service space, 20% of your revenue should be profit. If it is not, it means you're investing in something, and you need to make sure that investment is paying off. For many, many years, I had a 5% profit target as opposed to a 20% profit target. That means that I had 15 extra points to invest in the business. And I used my annual growth, the third one, year-over-year revenue growth, to determine if I was doing a good job. There's mainly in the SaaS world, this concept of the rule of 40. And it says your annual growth rate plus your profit margin, does it equal 40% or greater? And if the answer is yes, then you're doing something right and you want to keep on making those investments. And the last one is year-over-year revenue growth. And by the way, as anyone listening to this, if you're the CEO, you're going to be judged on those 3 KPIs. If you do an amazing job of those 3 KPIs, you're going to build a career for yourself. You're going to build a career for your employees. If you don't, you're not going to build a career for yourself. You're not going to build wealth. And so those are the 3 KPIs to follow. Now, the second part is that requires tough decision making. So once you know the decision that you needs to make, your profit margin is not what you want it to be. Your revenue growth is not what you want it to be. Well, then you have to figure out why. Oftentimes you have to make adjustments. You're going to have to make cuts in one area to invest in another area. We were very good at being disciplined and not only knowing what decisions to make because we had a data-driven framework to make decisions, but we were willing to make the tough decisions, even if sometimes it meant letting go of people we loved and we cared about and were in the trenches with, to reinvest in other areas.
Now, if you're working with a founder who faced some of the same challenges you were facing, and they lost their biggest account, like looking back now, what advice would you have for a founder in that situation?
So the first thing is accept the reality that you have to live with the revenue you have, not the revenue you want. So there's benchmarks in every single aspect of your spending. So you should have a 50% gross margin. You get 30% of your revenue for all of your non-client related expenses, 8% to sales, 15% to your back office, 7% to your executive team. And so if your revenue is down, you know exactly how much you should spend in every area. Then what you need to do with a massive sense of urgency is make the adjustments as quickly as possible. And by the way, people always worry about the culture, they worry about the team, and those are all things that you need to worry about. Your team will start understanding the way you operate and the way you run your business, where it's when you don't make those decisions. You lose 40% of your revenue and all of a sudden you're losing money and all of a sudden your cash gets depleted and all of a sudden you're making decisions based on the fact that you got to make payroll as opposed to what's right for the business. And so Those are my key recommendations are, get to the numbers, have the right sense of urgency, have the courage to make the tough decisions. And I promise you, you'll come out ahead, not just in terms of the profitability of the company, but from the respect of the people that stay within the organization.
One thing that's really standing out to me here, Jon, is that you know your numbers so well, but more importantly, you also know your benchmarks, right? I think earlier stage founders sometimes have pie in the skies ideas of what their budget numbers should be. And there's not a reality check there of what they should be for the industry, for the kind of business model they have and so forth. So really, really good job on knowing your numbers and the benchmarks. Before we wrap, a few quick rapid fire questions for you. If you had to start the agency all over again from scratch, what one lead source would you go all in on?
Partnership marketing. So it's what we did in the early stages. And, I think of an example where I had a massive opportunity and I completely missed out on it. Remember that client I told you about that went from 5 figures to 7 figures? So they were referred to me by Amazon. And Amazon had these comparison shopping engine services, and they were referring leads to me, and it wasn't a core part of my service offering. And I look back and I'm like, what an idiot I was. Like, I had one of the largest companies in the world sending me leads at volume, and I didn't stop everything I was doing and go all in on that. And so I think a lot of times about that was a massive miss on my part. So partnership marketing and specifically Amazon was something I should have gone all in on. I would have grown faster, even though I grew really fast.
Partnerships is a great lead source, especially for launching. So love that. All right. You and I both love reading. Aside from your business growth playbook, what are some of your other top favorite business books?
So I'm going to give you a different answer than probably any other answer you received. There is no best business book. Instead, there are best business books in very specific themes. And what you have to figure out is, what is your pain point? Let's just say you want to focus on lead generation. I want you to identify the 5 top books on lead generation. I want you to read all 5. If you want to focus on leadership, I want you to focus on 5 books on leadership. So for example, I read about Elon Musk, Satya Nadella, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. I did a whole series of 20th and 21st century tech leaders. I've read, Atomic Habits and Grit and Checklist Manifesto. And when you're focusing on, how to build the right habits and the right infrastructure. And so my answer is, you're never going to have that one book that, is the best book that teaches you everything. Pick your theme, go deep on it, and then go on to your next theme, and then go 5 books on that, and then keep on going. That's
really, you're right, a different take on it. And advice I've heard before that I enjoy is that if you do want to learn a subject, you go get the 10 books on the topic, you read them all, and you'll find conflicting advice within those and different frameworks and approaches, but you will also now know a subject very well.
Yep. And then you get your own point of view, right?
Yeah. You're not just repeating one author's perspective.
Exactly.
So mentors are so important to all of us in business. Who would you say, though, was one of your unlikeliest mentors?
A person named Jack Kraft was my pretty much major mentor for the vast majority of my adult career. When I started my first agency, it was in the mid-1990s, which was in the dot-com boom. And I was 22 to 24 years old during that time period. And it was amazing how many people were excited and interested in talking to me because I was in the, internet world and in my early 20s. And everyone thought this could be the next, Mark Zuckerberg type person. Turns out I was not the next Mark Zuckerberg. But so my lawyer, who was, I never even knew him. It was my mom's first cousin's husband, was the chair of Winston & Strawn's intellectual property. And he made all these introductions to me. And one of them was to Jack Kraft. And Jack was the former CFO and CEO and vice chairman of Leo Burnett. And he took a liking to me, and he met with me every single week for no compensation for around 2 years in my first agency. And then in my second agency, I ended up hiring him and talked to him on a daily basis. And so much of like the benchmark numbers I share, the way that I ran the business, the fact that we focus on 50 great customers, all these different things really came from him and his model, and was a huge driver of the success I had today.
Love that. Sometimes looking back, we don't know who those names will be. It's only in the rear view do we see it, but in the moment, it's not quite there. So that's awesome, Jon. All right. So to recap for our listeners, you moved from this devastating client loss that threatened the entire survival of the business to a strategy of extreme financial discipline and an aggressive investment in sales talent, which ultimately built one of the world's largest independent marketing firms. That
is a phenomenal summary.
Love it. And for our listeners who want to learn more about you, Jon, where should they go right now?
So you can go to fiscaladvocate.com. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I post every week. And send me an email, jon@fiscaladvocate.com. I'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. So that's fiscaladvocate.com or jon@fiscaladvocate.com. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your journey and your growth and all the things you did to double and grow and build and recover and create the company that you create. Big kudos and thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Quick reminder, hit that subscribe button right now so you can get more episodes when they come out automatically. And remember to leave that rating and review right now.